The cold air cut through the vast landscape as the small spacecraft descended, its engines humming softly. Captain Jace Mercer sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls. He was a seasoned warrior, one who had been through more battles and political dealings than most men could count. Yet today felt different. He had received orders that led him to this far-off planet, a place in the Outer Rim known for its harsh terrain and even harsher rulers. His mission was clear, but the situation was far from simple. He had been sent to negotiate a trade agreement with a distant alien empire. But as his ship touched down on the planet's surface, he knew there was something more at play here. Something he wasn't being told. Jace sighed, the weight of the unknown pressing on his shoulders. The barren landscape outside the window was nothing but dust and rocks. He had landed in the middle of nowhere, far from the usual bustling cities and trade hubs. It was clear that the empire he had been tasked to approach wasn't interested in making things easy for him. The hatch of the spacecraft opened with a hiss, and Jace stepped out onto the dusty ground. His boots crunched against the rough terrain as he surveyed the area. The air smelled of burning metal, a harsh industrial scent that made him wrinkle his nose. It was a far cry from the green fields and quiet towns of his home world. As he adjusted his weapon at his side, Jace noticed a group of soldiers emerging from behind a nearby rock formation. They moved swiftly, their heavy boots making no sound as they approached. Their armor glinted in the dim light, and their eyes were sharp, cold, calculating. The soldiers didn't speak, only gestured for him to follow. Without a word, Jace complied. He had no choice but to follow their lead. The more resistance he showed, the more likely he'd end up in a cell, or worse. The journey to the fortress-like compound felt endless. The towering walls of black stone loomed ahead, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. It was a place built for power, not comfort. No friendly faces, no sign of hospitality, just cold, efficient strength. They led him through the massive doors and into a high-ceilinged chamber where the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. A long table stretched in front of him, with alien diplomats sitting on either side, watching him with cold eyes. The Queen of the Empire sat at the far end of the table, her presence overwhelming. She was a tall, regal figure, draped in dark silks that shimmered in the dim light. Jace met her gaze, his expression unreadable. She studied him with an air of quiet authority, as though she was sizing him up for something far beyond what he had come to do. "Welcome to my court." The Queen's voice was smooth, like velvet, but it carried an edge. "You are far from your home, Captain Mercer. I trust your journey was not too uncomfortable." "It was fine," he replied, keeping his tone respectful but guarded. "But I believe we have matters to discuss." The Queen's eyes glittered as she smiled softly. "Indeed, I have heard much about you, Captain." "Your reputation precedes you." Her words were flattering, but Jace knew better than to take them at face value. Flattery from an enemy was a weapon, not a gesture of kindness. "I was told that you wished to discuss a trade agreement," Jace said, maintaining his stance. The Queen leaned forward slightly, her fingers stippled in front of her lips. "That is one of the reasons you are here. But I believe your presence serves a different purpose, Captain Mercer." Jace's brow furrowed slightly, though he kept his voice steady. "What do you mean?" The Queen's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "You see, Captain, this empire has needs. Needs that extend beyond trade routes and alliances. And I believe you are the solution to one of those needs." Before Jace could respond, a woman stepped forward from the shadows. She was tall, with dark hair that cascaded down her back, and her eyes, though beautiful, held a sadness that was impossible to ignore. Her clothing was more modest than the Queen's, though no less elegant. She was younger, but there was a strength in her posture that belied her delicate appearance. "This is my daughter, Princess Elara," the Queen said, gesturing to the woman. "She is the future of this empire. And you, Captain, have been chosen to help secure that future." Jace's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. The princess was beautiful. There was no denying that. But it was the way the queen spoke that caught his attention. The words were like a trap, pulling him deeper into something he didn't understand. "I don't understand," Jace said, his voice sharp.
"What is it you need from me?" The queen's smile didn't falter. "A simple request, Captain."
"Marry my daughter?" Jace blinked, momentarily stunned by the bluntness of the proposal. Marry the queen's daughter? It didn't make sense. He was here to negotiate, not to enter into some royal arrangement. But the queen wasn't finished. "In exchange for this marriage, I will grant you your freedom. You will leave here unharmed, your mission complete. But refuse me, and you will remain here as a prisoner, your fate sealed." Jace's mind raced, processing the implications of her words. This was no ordinary political play. It was a game of life and death. He wasn't just a negotiator anymore. He was a pawn in a larger scheme. "And if I refuse?" Jace asked, his voice low. The queen's smile faded slightly, but her tone remained calm. "Then you will remain here, a prisoner for the rest of your days. It will be up to me whether you live or die." Jace's heart thudded in his chest. He had never been one to bow to threats, but this was different. The queen was no ordinary ruler, and her empire was vast and powerful. It would be foolish to challenge her openly. He glanced at Princess Elara, whose eyes were fixed on him with an unreadable expression. There was a sadness there, but also a quiet strength, something that made him hesitate. She wasn't just a political tool. She was a person, trapped in a situation that was as much beyond her control as it was beyond his. "Why me?" Jace asked, his voice low. The queen leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "Because, Captain, you are the key to our survival. A union with you will solidify our alliances and secure the future of this empire. It is not a request I make lightly." Jace stood there, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. Marrying a princess, being forced into such a union, was not something he ever imagined for himself. But freedom was on the line. And if there was one thing Jace Mercer understood, it was the value of freedom. Still, something felt off. He could sense it in the air, the way the queen's eyes glimmered with something more than just political ambition. There was a deeper game at play here, and Jace was just beginning to realize that he might have stepped into something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. With a steady breath, Jace met the queen's gaze. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," he said, his voice firm. The queen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod.
"You have until tomorrow, Captain.
After that, the offer will be withdrawn and your fate will be sealed." The words hung in the air as Jace turned and walked toward the door, his mind racing. As he stepped back into the cold corridors of the fortress, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed. Forever. Jace sat in the small, dimly lit room, his back against the stone wall, his mind working furiously. The queen's words echoed in his head. "Marry my daughter and you will be free." It was a tempting offer. But the more he thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. There were too many unanswered questions. Why had the queen chosen him, a simple soldier, for such a delicate arrangement? And what did she truly want from him? He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, trying to clear his thoughts. His entire life had been shaped by duty, by loyalty to his people, and now it seemed like he was caught in a game far beyond his understanding. The stakes were high, and yet there was a part of him that couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much darker than what was being shown on the surface. The sound of footsteps outside his door broke his concentration. A soft knock followed, and then the door opened. It was one of the queen's guards, his expression unreadable. "Captain Mercer!" the guard said in a clipped tone. "The Queen has requested your presence." "You are to join her and the princess in the council room." Jace nodded, standing up slowly. The guard didn't wait for any further acknowledgement, stepping back to allow Jace to exit. The corridors were long and cold, the walls adorned with intricate, alien symbols that Jace couldn't begin to decipher. He could feel the weight of the Empire pressing down on him with every step he took. When he reached the council room, the large doors opened without a sound, revealing the Queen sitting at the head of a long table. Princess Elara stood by her side, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made Jace's heart skip a beat. The princess didn't say anything, but there was something in the way she looked at him, an unspoken question in her gaze.
"Captain," the Queen greeted him, her voice smooth but laced with authority.
"Please, take a seat." Jace did as instructed, sitting at the table across from the two women. His eyes briefly met Elara's, but he quickly looked away, focusing on the Queen instead. "We've discussed the terms of your release," the Queen began, her fingers lightly tapping the surface of the table. "But I understand that you may have questions. It's only fair, after all." Jace leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain his composure. He had made his decision earlier to take his time and weigh his options carefully. But now, sitting here in front of the Queen, with the princess beside her, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the choice bearing down on him. "Why me?" Jace finally asked, his voice low but steady. "What makes me the right choice for this arrangement?" The Queen's lips curled into a knowing smile.
It's not just about you, Captain Mercer.
"It's about the Empire. The alliance you would bring to this family could change the course of history." She paused, her gaze never leaving his. "Your reputation precedes you. You are a man of strength, a warrior who has earned the respect of many. This union will bring both political power and personal protection to my daughter." Jace felt his heart tighten. The Queen's words made sense, but there was something in her tone that made him uneasy. It was as if she was pushing him into something much larger than just a marriage proposal. "What do you expect from me once this marriage takes place?" Jace pressed, his brow furrowing. "Do I become your pawn, or is this truly about protecting your daughter?" Elara shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the word pawn, but the Queen didn't flinch. "Protecting Elara is my first priority," the Queen replied, her voice steady. "But she is the future of this empire. She needs a strong ally, someone who can help her navigate the political landscape. I believe you can be that ally."
Jace looked at Elara, who had been silent up until this point. She wasn't meeting his gaze now, her eyes cast downward.
Jace couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She was caught in the middle of a political game she hadn't chosen. "Do you agree with your mother's plan?" Jace asked softly, turning to face the princess.
Elara's gaze flickered to him for a moment before she spoke, her voice quiet but firm.
"I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Her words struck Jace like a slap, and for the briefest moment he saw the true weight of the situation in her eyes. She wasn't just a princess. She was a woman who had lost her husband and now found herself being forced into another marriage for the good of the Empire. Jace felt a surge of guilt for being part of this, for being the man who might just be the answer to her mother's political ambitions. "I don't want this," Elara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I will do what is necessary to protect my people." Jace's heart softened at her words. It was clear that she wasn't just some royal figurehead. She was a woman who had been placed in an impossible situation, and Jace realized, in that moment, that there was something more than just duty at play here. He could see the quiet strength in her, the resilience that came from within. The Queen leaned forward, breaking Jace's thoughts.
"I trust you understand the importance of this marriage. We will provide you with everything you need: resources, protection, allies."
"You will have all the freedom you desire, so long as you fulfill your duty to this family." Jace nodded slowly, though his mind was still racing. It was an enticing offer, one that promised freedom, power, and security, but the price was steep. Marriage wasn't just a contract between two people. It was a life-altering decision, and Jace wasn't sure he was ready for it.
I will need time, Jace said, his voice firm.
To consider everything. This is not a decision I can make lightly. The Queen's smile didn't waver.
Of course, Captain. Take all the time you need.
But remember, my offer is not without its limits. Once it expires, your fate will be sealed. Jace stood, his chair scraping against the stone floor as he pushed it back. He gave a respectful nod to the Queen and to Elara, who still didn't meet his gaze. Very well, he said, his voice steady. I will return tomorrow with my decision. As he left the room, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a political move. There was something more at play, something deeper that he couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear. His life had just taken a turn into unknown territory. He had no idea what lay ahead. But he knew that whatever happened, he would need to make his choice carefully. Jace walked through the cold corridors, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The princess's words echoed in his ears. I don't have much of a choice, do I? He stopped for a moment in front of a window, gazing out at the dark, star-filled sky. The galaxy seemed vast, filled with endless possibilities, and yet, here he was, stuck between two women, caught in the middle of their empire's politics. What was the right choice? Could he truly marry a woman he hardly knew, just to gain his freedom? Was he willing to risk everything for a life that wasn't his own? Jace took a deep breath and turned away from the window. He had made many hard decisions in his life, but this one felt different. This was not just about his future. It was about the future of an empire. And he wasn't sure he was ready to shoulder that responsibility. But he had no choice. He had to make a decision soon. And it was a decision that would change everything. Jace's decision weighed heavily on his mind. The more he considered the Queen's offer, the more complicated it became. The idea of marrying a woman he barely knew for political gain seemed like a betrayal of everything he stood for. But the alternative, remaining a prisoner, or worse, losing his life, was even more unappealing. He needed more time. But the Queen had made it clear that time was something he didn't have much of. He spent the next few hours pacing the small room assigned to him, running over every detail in his mind. The Queen's words echoed in his thoughts. But it was Elara's face that haunted him. Her quiet strength, her resigned acceptance of her fate, it made him question everything. She didn't want this marriage any more than he did, but her duty to her people seemed to outweigh her own desires. The decision was becoming more personal by the minute. He wasn't just making a choice for himself anymore. He was choosing whether to tie his life to hers, to walk into a future that neither of them truly wanted, for the sake of an empire neither of them had a say in. The door to his room opened, interrupting his thoughts. It was the same guard as before, his expression unreadable. "The Queen has requested your presence," the guard said simply, before stepping aside to allow Jace to exit. Jace nodded, not bothering to speak. He knew what was waiting for him: the Queen, her daughter, and the same offer that had been placed before him earlier. But now, he felt the pressure of that decision more than ever. The weight of it threatened to crush him with every step he took. The walk to the Queen's chambers was short, but felt like an eternity. The stone walls of the palace seemed to close in on him as he approached the council room. His thoughts raced as he prepared himself for what was to come. When the doors opened, Jace stepped inside. The Queen sat at the head of the long table, the familiar coldness in her eyes. Elara was beside her, her posture slightly more relaxed than before, though there was still a palpable tension in the room.
Captain Mercer, the Queen said, her voice warm but calculating.
I trust you've had time to consider my proposal. Jace met her gaze, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. I have, he replied, his voice steady, though the uncertainty in his chest was hard to ignore. The Queen smiled, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
I am pleased to hear that.
And what have you decided?
Jace took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had known this moment would come, but the pressure of it still felt overwhelming. His eyes flicked to Elara, who watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "I decided to accept your offer," Jace said finally, his words coming out more easily than he had expected. "But I need to understand exactly what you want from me. What will my role be in this empire once the marriage takes place?" The Queen's smile widened, and she leaned forward slightly, as if pleased by his answer. "Your role will be vital, Captain. As my son-in-law, you will hold great influence within the Empire. You will assist Elara in leading this empire to greater prosperity. Your expertise as a warrior will be invaluable, and your presence will strengthen our alliances with neighboring systems." Jace nodded slowly, though he didn't fully trust the Queen's words. There was something about the way she spoke, so assured, so confident, that made him feel like a pawn in a much larger game. But he had made his decision. He had accepted her offer, and there was no turning back now. "And Elara?" Jace asked, his gaze moving to the princess. She hadn't spoken since he entered, but he could feel the tension in the room growing. "What is her role in all of this?" The Queen glanced at her daughter before turning her attention back to Jace. "Elara will be the one to lead the Empire in the long term. She is the future. You will help her guide this empire, but ultimately, it will be her decisions that shape our future. Your role will be to protect her, to ensure that her leadership remains strong." Jace looked at Elara, who met his gaze for the first time. There was something vulnerable in her eyes. Something that made him feel even more uncertain about his decision. She was not just a princess, not just a political tool to be used in a game of power. She was a woman who had been thrust into a position of responsibility, forced to sacrifice her own desires for the sake of her people. "What do you want, Elara?" Jace asked softly, his voice gentle. "Do you want this marriage?" Elara's gaze faltered for a moment, and Jace could see the struggle in her eyes. She wanted to speak, wanted to answer him, but she was trapped in a situation where her words felt meaningless.
I don't have a choice, Elara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"But it's what must be done, for the good of the Empire."
Her words hit Jace harder than he had expected. He had known she didn't want this marriage, but hearing her admit it so openly made him realize the weight of the decision he had just made. He was marrying a woman who didn't want him, not because of love or desire, but because it was her duty, and he was doing the same. Not out of choice, but because it was the only way out. The Queen's eyes flicked between them, a knowing look in her gaze.
"This marriage will not just secure your future, Captain. It will secure the future of the entire Empire. You both have a duty to this family and to this empire. Do not forget that."
Jace nodded, though a knot twisted in his stomach. He had made his decision, but the reality of it was beginning to set in. He was bound to Elara, bound to this empire, and the future seemed uncertain at best. The Queen stood then, her movements graceful and measured. "The ceremony will take place tomorrow," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Prepare yourself, Captain. Your future begins tomorrow." Jace stood as well, his mind still reeling from the decision he had just made. He turned toward the door, his thoughts in turmoil. The weight of the Queen's words hung over him, and the knowledge that there was no turning back now made the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. As he walked down the long corridor back to his room, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that this marriage was only the beginning. The politics of this empire, the games being played, were far from over, and he was about to become more than just a player. He was about to become part of the very game he had sworn to avoid. The next day would change everything. But for now, Jace could only try to prepare himself for the uncertain future that awaited him. The day of the ceremony arrived far too quickly. Jace awoke to the soft light filtering through the narrow window of his room. It felt like just another day, but he knew it wasn't. Today, everything would change. His life, his future, all of it was now tied to this empire, this woman, and a choice that had been forced upon him. As he stood and dressed in the ceremonial attire provided for him, his thoughts raced. He had made his decision to marry Elara, but the reality of it was beginning to hit him with full force. He was a soldier, a man who had always lived by his own rules, fighting for freedom, for honor. And now, he was stepping into a role that had nothing to do with the life he had known. He was about to become the husband of a woman who had no desire for him, not because of love, but because it was her duty to her people. The weight of the crown on her head was more than just a symbol of her power. It was a symbol of everything she had sacrificed, everything she had lost. And Jace? He was just another piece in the Queen's game of strategy. He could already feel the chains binding him to this empire. No matter how hard he tried to break free, there would always be a force pulling him back. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was the guard again, the same one who had been with him since he first arrived. His expression remained neutral as always. "The ceremony is about to begin," the guard said, his voice calm. "It is time." Jace nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. He couldn't back out now, even if he wanted to. There was no escape from this path he had chosen. He followed the guard through the winding corridors of the palace, the cold stone walls pressing in on him. When they reached the grand hall, Jace saw that the room was filled with dignitaries and high-ranking officials, all seated in neat rows, their eyes on the altar at the front. The air was thick with expectation. Every eye in the room was on him. His breath caught in his throat as he approached the front, where Elara stood, looking every bit the regal princess, though her eyes betrayed her calm exterior. She was as trapped as he was. She glanced up at him briefly, but there was no warmth in her gaze, only the quiet resolve of someone who had accepted their fate. The silence between them was heavy. No words passed between them, yet they both understood the gravity of the situation. They were bound together by duty, not love. And though neither of them had chosen this path, they were about to walk down it together. The Queen stood beside her daughter, her posture perfect, her eyes sharp. She watched Jace with a gaze that was both approving and calculating. He could feel the weight of her expectations pressing down on him. This wasn't just about marriage. It was about the survival of an empire. Jace took his place beside Elara, trying his best to hide the tension in his shoulders. The ceremony began with the traditional words, spoken in a language Jace didn't fully understand, but the meaning was clear. He could feel Elara's presence beside him, her body tense, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. As the ceremony continued, Jace felt as if he were standing outside of himself, watching everything unfold as though it were happening to someone else. The vows were spoken, each word feeling more like an obligation than a promise. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd around them, their expectations evident in their hushed whispers. But it was the moment when the Queen stepped forward, placing the ring on his finger, that Jace felt the finality of it all. He was no longer just Captain Jace Mercer. He was now part of this empire. His future, his life, were tied to this woman and his family in a way he could never escape. When the ceremony ended, there was no grand celebration, no joy in the air. Only the quiet hum of people going through the motions, following the rules they had been given. The Queen and Princess Elara both turned to face the crowd, their faces carefully composed. Jace did the same, his mind still reeling from the events of the last hour. As the guests began to file out of the hall, Jace caught a glimpse of Elara, standing by herself at the far end of the room. She was looking out the window, her back turned to him, her posture stiff. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, but knowing that he couldn't leave things like this. "Elara," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the silence of the room. She didn't turn to face him, but he could see the slight tension in her shoulders. She knew he was there. "I didn't want this," Elara said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness.
I didn't want any of this, but now we're both trapped in this.
There's no escaping it. Jace stood beside her, his gaze following hers as she stared out the window, the stars visible in the distance. I know, he said, his voice low. I never imagined my life would lead me